Hello and welcome back to HEMA Breakdowns. Today I want to talk about speed, particularly how you get faster at fencing. So recently at AGO, although not so recently anymore, I fought Jeffrey Wills, who is a very fast and very good fencer out of Stephen Cheney's club, and we had some really fast and good looking exchanges that I luckily got to record in slow motion. And what we can do here is we can break down these exchanges and find out, one, how both of us were able to throw so fast, and not only throw so fast, but parry so fast, but also what goes into trying to train this so that you can throw exchanges like these. So for all of these exchanges, I am going to be on the right in the white shoes, Jeff is going to be on the left in the black shoes, and for all of these exchanges, the speed that we have here is going to come from a basic principle of parrying and then throwing a counterattack. In this particular exchange, Jeff comes forward, he doesn't really throw anything of consequence or threat, so I try to counterattack by throwing a big attack over the top towards his head. Now when you watch the slow-mo, this does appear to kind of land, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to say it doesn't. Jeff parries, throws a counterattack immediately on his right side. I throw a parry on my left side, trying to counter that attack. I parry, then I throw a counterattack Zverkow over the top. Jeff parries that Zverkow and then throws another Zverkow of his own. And this entire sequence takes place over the form of about a second. The reason we are able primarily to throw these combinations so quickly is because we are guessing. We are essentially guessing, based on previous experience, where that counterattack is going to come from, where we need to put our parries, and what counterattack we're going to throw the second we feel contact. The reason this is effective is because it takes away a lot of the observation step of trying to fence. Blades move very quickly and are very difficult to read. And a lot of the time, speed doesn't actually come from responding to what somebody else is doing, but trying to predict them. In this case, the obvious predictive model that both of us are going off of is that every time we parry on one side, chances are the person is going to throw a follow-up attack on the opposite side. Why? Well, if I parried on one place and then you tried to throw a counterattack on the other side, I have to travel that entire distance to protect myself. Similarly, if I just got a parry on that side, and I want to throw my counterattack on the opposite side, you have to go all the way there in order to get your parry up. So it's a really good, simple way to look at any kind of exchange, and a great way to make your counterattacks and your parries more efficient. In this particular case, though, the reason that Jeff was inevitably successful is because I threw a cut on my right side, Jeff parried it on his left side, and then he threw a follow-up cut on his same side. He broke the pattern of going from attack one side and then parry on the other, or parry on one side and attack on the other, and that was the reason that I chose the wrong parry. When you watch this final little blow in slow motion, what you see me doing is I throw my attack, it gets parried, and I immediately start trying to shove my hands toward my bottom left side, even though Jeff's attack is coming on the opposite quadrant. The reason I do that is because I was trying to predict what he was going to do, and I didn't predict accurately. At the exact same time, Jeff was able to predict that I was stuck in a pattern, and he had a pre-programmed response in his head to break that pattern. And this is the 1, 2, 3 step process of this kind of thing that can make you very fast. If every single time you parry, you immediately throw a counterattack to the opposite side, you are going to do so very quickly. And you are probably going to land it. But if you don't land it, and you notice that your opponent is getting into a pattern, being able to also pre-program a break in that pattern once you get to the third or fourth instance is another great thing that's going to make you look very fast. Because a lot of times, going fast isn't about doing something particularly fast at all. It's about doing something that the opponent either did or did not predict. Looking like a god and throwing your sword up where a sword is not present makes you look fast, but actually you're just guessing. So you either work off of the guesses that you think your opponent is using, or you try to work off of the fact that being able to guess first will often make you the first one to land. Another way that you can really speed up your exchanges is to have a good idea of where certain attacks are vulnerable and where certain attacks are not vulnerable. And a lot of this comes down to the distinction between cuts and thrust in terms of where they can attack and where they cannot attack. In this particular exchange, Jeff comes forward once again, throws an attack towards my hand, I parry it, and I get him with what he got me on, just that exchange before. I parry on my left side, and I throw a cut to his right side, which means it attacks on the exact same quadrant that I just parried on, which he was not expecting. In this case, I managed to just barely clip a little bit of his shoulder, but we continued the exchange. But what happens after that is that Jeff responds to what is essentially me trying to back out of range and throws a completely different technique than a cut in order to break up the pattern. He throws a thrust that tickles the bottom of my chin and lifts my mask up, which does mean that it landed pretty nicely. But the reason this worked really doesn't have anything to do with the kind of parry repost to an opposite quadrant like I talked about in the last exchange, but with the idea that thrusts come in through the center and only come in through the center if there is nothing in the center at present. So I want you to imagine a scenario. Just like in this exchange, somebody throws a cut and somebody parries it on their side. Cuts have to come in from the outside towards the inside, but thrusts can start on the inside and remain on the inside. So what happens here is that when I parry on my outside line, I have to throw a cut because in order to go from the outside to the inside, I basically have to move my sword from a position where it cannot thrust to a position where it can thrust, which means I do so with a cut. I parry on my outside, I throw a cut to get back to the inside. Now, Jeff does the exact same thing here. He gets hit, though it doesn't really matter for the sake of this argument, and parries on his outside, but he finds that because he has parried in such a way that he got hit, his sword is actually in the middle now. In this particular instance, he is not on the outside, which means he does not need to throw a cut. If he had thrown a cut, he would have to go back to the outside line and then cut back around to the inside, which would be significantly slower. So, if you can recognize when you're sitting on the outside line and throw a cut, it's going to look really fast. But if you recognize when you're on the inside line and you throw a thrust, it's going to also be very, very fast. And the best thing about throwing a thrust when you already have the inside line is that your opponent has to cross the inside line with their blade in order to get you out, which means they essentially have to throw a cut. If you understand cuts and thrusts in this paradigm, what this essentially means is that you're paying attention to where your sword is and where it's trying to go, your opponent, and choosing your attack based on that paradigm. If you are on the outside, you throw a cut. If you are on the inside, you throw a thrust. And it has absolutely nothing to do with where you were, where you just parried, or where you just threw. And that actually does counteract a lot of the training that people get. A lot of people, when they feel somebody throw a big cut at them, their first instinct is to throw a big cut back. And there's a reason for that. Every time you take a big hit on your sword, it gives some of that momentum to your blade and to your arms. And it feels good to take a hit on one side and swing it all the way around your head and throw a big cut on the opposite side. But the problem is that if you had to go all the way to the outside of one side to parry, and then you swing all the way around to the other side, you're going through the center in the wrong direction. You should always cut through the center in the shortest distance, which means that every time you parry on the outside, you should cut through the middle. Cutting through the middle also will defend you from any thrust that someone might be throwing at you. And what happens here is you get this really clean 3-step process that you see on display here, where cutting around isn't necessarily wrong, but it is something that can be interrupted, and it can be interrupted with a thrust that comes straight down the pipe. So if you do what Jeff does here, and every time somebody throws one of those cuts on your outside line and you find your structure collapses a little bit, or maybe you're out of range, or for whatever reason you end up in the center rather than on the outside, throw that point straight down the middle, and you are going to land it on them 9 times out of 10, because when somebody throws a cut and they get parried, their instinct is almost always going to be to throw another cut. And that thrust is going to interrupt them very, very effectively. Now, for our third example, we have another method that helps keep our fencing fast, and that is keeping your hands high. When we watch this exchange, I come forward with a thrust. Jeff sets me off to the side and throws a really nice counters Verkow straight down over the top. Now, I try to parry in a hanging style, but I don't quite make it and I get hit in the head. And if we analyze this closely, the reason that I do not make this parry is because after I throw my thrust, I rechamber my hands towards my hip. And this crucial loss of efficiency is all that it takes for me to then have to bring my hands back up into position to protect my head, which is going to take out a couple crucial milliseconds, which is enough for Jeff to hit me in the head. So, why else does keeping your hands high really help? One, we are human beings and our arms are all attached to our shoulders, which means that the shortest distance between our sword's anchor to our body, our shoulder, and our opponent forms a horizontal plane along the line of our shoulder. What that means is that if you fence with your hands in line with your shoulder, you are going to have maximum reach. And most importantly, you're going to be able to do smaller motions to protect your shortest distance and your most available target. A lot of people like to fight with their hands down and towards their hips because it feels safer there. And to an extent, they're right. However, one thing you need to consider is that in order to bring your sword to bear from that position down low, you have to bring your hands up. And that process of bringing your hands up is often when people get hit. Also, it's usually when they're throwing their own attack. So what people need to consider is that if you start off with your guard already in that shoulder line height, you're cutting out a lot of distance and a lot of travel that your hands and your sword have to go, not only to keep you safe, but to throw attacks of your own. So in a lot of ways, it behooves people to keep their hands higher just overall and to better learn how to use their cross guard by pointing it forward and just, keeping their sword to bear. That makes them safe in that different way rather than keeping it low and off to the side. As we see from this exchange, if I had never rechambered my hands down towards my hips, I probably would have been able to make that hanging parry, and I probably would have been able to continue to grapple. Both two things that would have benefited heavily from my hands being up higher. You grapple from your hands at your shoulder level for the most part. You sword fight with your hands at the shoulder level. You parry with your hands at the shoulder level. And while it is definitely a habit early on for people to throw low strikes to the hands, moving your hands down in order to parry them is a little bit of a loss of efficiency, but the fact that you can counter anybody going low by going high at the exact same time and keeping that efficiency of range means that you have a much more effective strategy for countering hand snipers outside of trying to parry them where they're going, but by staying high and always attacking their head and their shoulder line. So if you want to stay fast, keep your hands high because it's going to keep that distance short. It's going to keep those attacks efficient. It's going to keep those parries where they need to stay. And even if somebody goes low on you and manages to hit you, chances are, if you got your combinations ready in your head, you're going to hit them back in the head way faster. Now, this exchange was not fully recorded, but it does emphasize very heavily the fourth method that you can use to keep your fencing fast, which is to utilize distance. Now, I've talked a lot about distance before, and in the last couple of videos, I've talked a lot about footwork, but what a lot of people don't necessarily understand is that distance isn't just a measure of what your feet are doing or which direction your body is going, but also a distance factor of understanding that certain techniques work better at certain distances, and as a result, the timing of them is going to change based on what position you happen to find yourself in. In this particular exchange, I throw another big attack coming forward. I try to charge Jeff down. He pivots me out of the way with a little bit of a stiff arm. But what happens after that is I throw a one-handed cut that manages to kind of clip him on the head. Now, I don't really care about the result of this match, but what I want to point out here is that by choosing to throw a one-handed cut, I took advantage of a long-distance attack that happened to be beneficial in the very specific situation that I was in at the time. Because I had charged forward and Jeff had pivoted off to my right side, I had to throw some kind of follow-up cut in order to try to present a threat. However, my momentum was still going forward and I was unable to stop myself from going out of the ring, which means that my choice of technique has to be very, very particular. If I tried to plant my feet, pivot, and throw a nice, well-structured cut from my left to my right, Jeff would have been well out of distance, which means the speed of my attack would have been far too slow. Because I choose a one-handed attack, I choose a one-handed attack that is on the same side as my opponent, which means that my arm is going to have the sufficient distance to reach my opponent, even though he is trying to back out of the engagement, and it doesn't matter that my momentum is currently going in the wrong direction. Understanding and being able to comprehend what kind of distance you are at from your opponent is a very, very difficult thing to learn. However, if you always have your counterattacks and your combinations in mind, you know that you are able to pick one based on the kind of distance you're at. Severe cows are generally very close range attacks. Cuts from the shoulder are longer range attacks, and one-handed cuts are even longer than that. If you can pick the right technique at the right time, your distance can still be fast even if your body is moving in the wrong direction. So, that is it. If you would like other tips like this, I will be around next Tuesday, but until then, I'll see you next time.